have consoles. So I thought I'd start by saying, let's state of the union, sort of where are we on the Monad Manifesto, and we'll kind of grade ourselves. So when it comes to the automation model, the idea here was that there are lots of people that have things that need to be managed, and that we want them to be able to manage them all in a very consistent way. And precisely that, I created a framework where they had to write the code that they and only they could write, and then they get a huge benefit from that, right? They didn't have to write a parser, they didn't have to write formatting, they didn't have to write, all these other tools. It was a good deal for people who managed things. And it turns out this has worked out exceptionally well. Originally, these commandlets were all written in .NET, but then we allowed it to be so that you could write commandlets in script, in native code. That was crucial. Once we did native code, we got the Windows guys on board, and that's where we crossed the chasm in terms of coverage and critical mass for coverage. You can write these as workflows. If you have an OData endpoint, we will automatically generate these PowerShell commandlets. And we're now working so that if you have a REST API and you annotate it with Swagger, we will also auto-generate commandlets. That's not out yet, that's in development, that's working out pretty great. Now in terms of the shells, we have a wide range of shells. Of course, the console itself has been a weak point, but PowerShell.exe and then was pretty reasonable. And then PS Readline really kind of made it quite useful. That was an open source project, and then we included it in the product. And recently after what, 15, 20 years of no progress whatsoever, the console team has woken up and has started to invest in the console, and that team is actually pretty revved up. They're excited. They do very small things. They just added transparency, and the world went nuts. I mean, it was hilarious, right? Because I was at the build conference, right? It used to be the PDC, and you had Joe Belfiore up there, right? And he's talking about this and that, all these like fancy whiz-bang, blah, 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 blah. And everyone's like saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then he shows the console, and you can have transparency, and the crowd erupted. It's like the only big applaud he got. It's hilarious. Anyway, so that team is paying attention. They recently introduced 24-bit color. They're improving the speed, so that's getting much better. Of course, we've had PowerShell ISE, an interactive scripting and debugging environment. And more recently, Visual Studio Code now has PowerShell. Visual Studio has PowerShell support and Visual Studio Code. This just went to 1.0. How many people are using Visual Studio Code? Okay, lots, but not everybody. If you haven't tried it, I strongly encourage you to. I will tell you that this is where our investment's going to go. We will do some finishing work on PowerShell ISE, but and you'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about Linux. PowerShell ISE, by its nature, is Windows only, and you'll see our future is to be cross-platform. Visual Studio Code is 1, awesome, and 2, cross-platform. So that's where the bulk of our investment is going to be going forward. And we recently introduced something called the Cloud Console. The Cloud Console is, if you go up to the Azure portal, up at the top you'll see something that looks like a prompt, and you click it and you get an interactive session. Now right now you can get an interactive bash session with the Azure CLI, and we have a private preview of a PowerShell environment. So basically we're running PowerShell on Windows in a container, and you have access to your subscription. We log you in as yourself, and we mount Azure as a drive, right? So Azure as a drive, basically you can say CD into Azure, you're already there. You can do a dir, you'll see your subscriptions, you can CD into one of the subscriptions, see your resource groups, see your VMs, etc. Okay, so you mount things as a drive. So in terms of these shells, I think we've done a pretty good job. I think that's going quite well. In terms of the scripting, well, I just think we've hit a home run here. Originally, we wanted to have a scripting language that spanned operators and developers, right? PowerShell was DevOps before DevOps was cool, okay? And we've had that. You can have a nice, quick ad hoc scripting, like a bash style script with $args, or you can be very sophisticated and do advanced functions in your scripting. That only went so far, and with version 4, we introduced classes, right? And I'll tell you the story behind that in a bit. But basically, we introduced classes, script analyzer, the PowerShell gallery. We've integrated in with the anti-malware agent on Windows, and security just through the roof with PowerShell version 5. If you've never read it, I strongly encourage you to find and read a blog written by Lee Holmes. So if you just search PowerShell and Blue Team, you'll find it. Fantastic document about security. So in terms of the shell and scripting, man, we're great. It's fantastic. In terms of remoting, a lot of the commandlets themselves do remoting. I don't really count that, but it's an important thing to note. By the way, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but you can do get command and give a parameter name. Did you ever know that? So basically, and here what I said was, get command, parameter name, anything that takes a computer name or a sim session, and it'll tell you that. So that's a cool trick, you know? Yeah. You can even say, use wildcards in there. So you can say get command, find any command that has a parameter starting with sim. So you say get command minus parameter name sim star. Pretty cool stuff. Anyway, so that's how you can find all the stuff that does their own remoting. But we have generalized PowerShell remoting. This works over a number of protocols, and that's a growing list. We have WSMan. That's the protocol implemented by the WinRM API, or the WinRM service. We have name pipes for local connections. We added VM bus, right? So VM bus, this allows you to do, we call it PowerShell Direct. You're able to say new PowerShell session minus VM name, and then you use the VM bus to talk to a PowerShell session. And if you ever want to demo something cool to people, you do that, and then you disable all the NICs, and it still works. It's glorious. Right? By the way, it's fantastic if you ever want to test out debugging networking of a VM. Right? How do you do that when you're using the NIC? Anyway, we are adding OpenSSH to this list. Okay, so again, in this sense, pretty darn good. In terms of the managing console, a little bit less here. So we have the Exchange admin console. We've had Server Manager. David Williams, the guy who is doing the Visual Studio Code, PowerShell extension for Visual Studio Code, has started a project called Phosphor. Now, David's, I think, the guy who's doing open source the best in the team, and by that, with PowerShell, it had some physics to it, right? We're on version 5, so we're taking that and we're open sourcing it. Now we're open sourcing it and we're doing it as transparently as we can, but we got 10 years or 14 years worth of code. With Phosphor, the way you really want to do open source is to say, hey, I have an idea, and let's together as a community flesh out that idea and start together from the code. That's how Visual Studio, the Visual Studio Code PowerShell extension was, and that's the same thing with this Phosphor. So Phosphor is an attempt that said, if you write PowerShell commandlets and you write them according to a particular pattern, we can auto-generate web GUIs for you. So, so if you go to that project today, you'll say, what the heck, there's nothing there. Don't go there unless you want to join in that, provide some feedback. Otherwise, wait a few months and see where they get. Anyway, so is PowerShell done? And the answer is, if you take a look at what we sought out to do, yeah, largely it is done. Of course, there's always a long tail. But it's done. We've achieved critical mass as a general purpose Windows scripting tool. So if we just wanted to be a general purpose Windows scripting tool, we would now shift gears, reduce the investment, sort of go into maintenance mode, prioritize and give it a certain budget and just prioritize a list of features. But that's not what we're doing. Because the cloud changes everything. The cloud changes everything. The new mission for PowerShell is to become the connector of the hybrid cloud, right? To be able to manage from any client, managing any server, running on any cloud, or on premises, using anybody's hypervisors, anybody's storage stack, anybody's networking stack, okay? This is the new mission. So is PowerShell done? No, not at all. We in fact are increasing our investment in PowerShell. It was part of the vision behind the recent reorganization. The reorganization, we basically took the PowerShell team and merged it with the Azure Automation team. So we have more people, and they're both delivering on a platform and a solution. We are shifting from just a pure platform play to being platform and solutions. And we're shifting our focus from being focused in on managing a particular server to being able to manage clouds, applications, and services. So now I thought I'd step back, right, and say, hey, let's do that architecture trick, right? What's the pattern behind the details? And what I'd say is that whenever you get to a point where you've sort of reached a critical mass or achieved some level of success, you have a choice. And your choice is to say, declare success and pursue a path of incremental change, or to step up and do transformational change, okay? And this happens in lots of cases, and it's a distinction worth getting in focus. And you want to get this pattern in focus so that when you confront a circumstance, you can make a conscious decision and then understand the ramifications of that decision. So let's talk about that. Because incremental change is fundamentally different than transformational change, right? With incremental change, you know the answer, you just need to implement it, right? Hey, PowerShell is a Windows scripting host, got 14 years experience in this, 10 years public, I know the things that people want, I know what they're trying to do, boom, 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 boom. With transformational change, you don't know the answer, and sometimes you don't even know the question, right? So we want to be the tool that merges all this stuff together. How do you prioritize that, right? So that's a very difficult thing. With incremental change, you want to sharpen your thinking, but with transformational change, you really have to create new thinking. With incremental change, there's a very high probability of success. You know what to do, we've done it a gazillion times. You might have to work a little hard, but you will succeed. With transformational change, you will fail. You will fail. Now let me take a second and talk about failure. People are rarely comfortable with failure, but it's important to get comfortable with failure. And here's how you get comfortable with failure. You realize that there are two types of failure. Failure number one is you come to me and you say, Jeffrey, I just spent 2 days on this and I failed. Or you come to me and you say, hey Jeffrey, I just spent 2 years on this and I failed. See the difference between those two? Okay? If you've spent 2 days and you failed at something, it's like, okay, well, did you get 2 days worth of learning out of it? If so, great, let's move on. If you spent 2 years on something and failed, well, that's a big failure, right? That's an unrecoverable failure. So failure, the key is to, fail quickly, right? And fail in small increments. We just recently hired an executive from Google, and he said that they know to the dollar how much an outage costs. And so they were reviewing one of the outages, and they said, okay, well, how much did this outage cost us? And they said, $2.4 million. Okay, well, did we get more $2.4 million worth of learning out of it? And they're like, yeah. He said, okay, good, let's move on. So that's the way you want to think about failure, because in transformational change, you will have failures. And with incremental change, who you think of yourselves are, your identity and who your customers are, that stays the same. With transformational change, you have new customers and you have a new identity, what you are. And then lastly, and this is perhaps the toughest, is that with incremental change, the team stays intact, but with transformational change, not everybody makes it, okay? These are really hard things. These are super hard things. You have a team that's been rocking it, doing great, they know their customers, I talk to you, I know exactly what your problem is, and I know how to fix it, and then, I'm not gonna deliver that to you, because there's somebody else and I don't really know who they are and I don't even like them if I do know them, and I gotta do something for them, and then I tried it and then I failed. That's a good deal? What the hell am I doing here? And a lot of people, when faced with that reality, instead of having the grit and the courage to muscle through it to get to that new approach, will fall back and say, no, 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 I just want to do what I used to do, and they don't make it. And by the way, when you have those people, you have to decide what you're going to do with them. How long do you give them to get with the program? Anyway, so not everybody makes it. So these transformational changes are super, super hard, and in particular, it's very easy to fail. Lots of people fail at this all the time. And the way they do it is they treat it like an incremental change. Now, it's important to realize that these transformational changes are so hard, like staying in that zone of discomfort for very long is really wearing on you. So sometimes you need to take a break from that and go do some incremental change. You know, just get some wins behind your belt as a respite, right? So it's one thing to do that for a couple hours, a couple days, but if you're doing it for a couple weeks and a couple months, chances are you're on the path to failure for your transformational change. So you want to be, you recognize that it's a tool you will probably need to use, falling back for an incremental change, but it's a dangerous tool, so don't use it a lot. Satya talks a lot about the growth mindset, and that's effectively what he's talking about, is adopting the patterns that allow you to do this transformational change, right? In a traditional mindset, failure is something to be avoided at all cost. You want to stay in your comfort zone. The growth mindset, you know, failure is an opportunity to learn. You know, negative feedback is great. You learn things from that. You know, you have this challenger mindset, and you try new things, okay? So that's what the growth mindset's all about. Now, let's talk about examples of transformational change. I assert if you're in this room, you've already participated in one of the big transformational changes. That's going from managing Windows with a GUI to automating it. Did everybody, was that all easy for everybody? Your companies and your teammates just like, yeah, just jump on it right away? It was hard, right? It was hard, especially in the early days when we didn't have full coverage and you need to do your heavy lifting today. If you're starting today, technically it's easier, but it's still just as hard because it's this transformational change. People know how to click next. I'm a rock star. I click next 5 times a year. I did something. Give me a raise. You know, there's a prompt like, what the hell do I do with that? Oh, I got to think. Really? Anyway, so this has been a transformational change, and you've successfully done that. Another transformational change people are dealing with now is getting rid of managing silos and going to management of the full stack, right, the full portfolio. It turns out that having a Windows managing team separate from a Linux managing team is expensive and it costs you agility. What happens when one team needs to help the other? Huh? What happens if I decide to shift my mix? I fire people and hire people? What happens if I shift the other way and fire the people I just hired? Right? So people want to move to a management of the full portfolio, and that's fundamentally different. The shift from traditional IT to DevOps is a transformational change, as well as the shift from on-premises computing to computing using cloud and public cloud. And for us, Windows PowerShell versus core PowerShell is a transformational change. Now here I want to talk about some terminology. Windows PowerShell is the Windows-only version of PowerShell that uses the full .NET desktop framework. Okay? That is currently version 5.1. Core PowerShell shipped in Windows Server 2016, 5.1, in Nano Server, and it is the basis for the open source project, PowerShell version 6. Okay? Windows PowerShell will probably never go to version 6. Windows PowerShell will go to 5.2, maybe a 5.3. We're really going to try and reduce our investment on that because that mission, we've achieved critical mass. We have a new mission, and that's where the investment will be. So that's where the core PowerShell will go from version 6 to version 7, etc. So core PowerShell is a transformational change. Again, going from managing any client, managing any server in any cloud, Azure, AWS, GCE, using any hypervisor, Hyper-V, VMware, using any storage or any networking stack. Big task. So, thought I'd drill into some of the aspects of what it takes to accomplish that mission. The first and foremost is that.
So, since now you have like people using PowerShell for a decade, like you're gonna kind of have, when you move to the next version of PowerShell, you're gonna have laggards that might be holding PowerShell back as opposed to holding, as opposed to like not adopting. Like, is that a different challenge, you think, than getting those people onto Windows?
So the question was, hey, will you have the same phenomena going to PowerShell version 6? Will the people who use PowerShell version 5, will they be the laggards and slow things down? We'll see, right? Our goal is to make PowerShell version 6 a compelling value proposition even for those people. So we'll see how we do. So first is we had to open source PowerShell. This was incredibly difficult. You have no idea how difficult this was. PowerShell is a Windows component. Basically what that means is it's part of a build and a test system that was built exclusively for Windows. It's almost embedded into the foundation of the buildings. Like, you want to move it to a different building, like you won't be able to build it anymore. It's that fragile and brittle. And so lifting that up and getting it into GitHub, the source code was the easiest portion of it. But redoing the build and the test, we basically had to, are walking away from 14 years worth of test development and starting from scratch. That's kind of painful. It's one of the reasons why right now our test coverage is low. It's lower, the number that we report out is lower than we think it is. We think it's higher, but still, that's a big, big challenge. Now again, think about the transformational challenge here, right? And by the way, no glory in any of this work. Nobody goes home and says, "Hun, you don't believe, I rewrote 4 test cases today." No. We said, "Hey, guess what, buddies? I moved all this course code to GitHub, or I redid the build. Oh, so what's it do now?" Well, what it did before. Right? No glory in any of this work. So now, let's get this in focus. Got a team of people. I want to talk to people like you. What are your problems? Oh, here's what I need. Here's what I need next. I can do that for you. I know what to do. I can deliver that for you. And wait, what? I don't get to do that. I gotta not deliver any features to go do this hard, grueling work just to do what? Like, get it building somewhere else? That's hard. Right? That's hard. That's really hard. And so it takes toughness, grit, to do these things. We had to establish a community process, right? Open source is not just, hey, I'm doing my thing in GitHub. That's not it. It's about how do we open up to allow you, the community, to participate in this, and not, well, thanks, screw you. No, how do you set up a community process? How do you deal with difficult situations? How do you create an environment where the community can commit code to the code base as well? So we had a lot of help from the open source community, and particularly the Chef people. They were very helpful in setting this up with us. And then when we launched the open sourcing of PowerShell, we had launch partners. These are not your traditional launch partners. In fact, I had a number of Microsoft execs that were like, wait, who? What? What? So our launch partners were AWS, VMware, and Google. Now the VMware guys are particularly interesting. I love the VMware friends. They had said that they had this problem that they had. I said, well, what problem is that? They said, well, Azure, I said, you got a problem with PowerShell? No, PowerShell's awesome, but that's the problem. Why is that a problem? I said, well, because my Windows guys, they love the great experience that they have. But my Linux guys look at it and they feel like they're getting a second-class automation experience. And in reality, they are. So that's a problem for us. Oh, I see. So they were very enthusiastic when they found out that they would be able to take their investment in PowerShell and deliver that experience to their Linux users. So they're very happy about that. Okay, so one of the core things we need to do is to open source PowerShell. Next is we got to get PowerShell running on Linux. Open sourcing is different than Linux. Get it running on Linux. First thing we had to do was to run on .NET Core, because that's the cross-platform version. Has anyone ported an existing application to .NET Core 1? Anybody try it? Okay, 1. Anybody try it? Successful? No, man, it's hard. Here's what happened. They did a great job, great engineers. They over-refactored. Okay, they over-refactored. And basically, if you're starting from scratch, fine. Most people, yeah, get my head around it. Most people who had existing applications that tried to port it looked and said, you did too much refactoring, there's not enough there, it's too much work, we're not gonna do it, right? And they wait till version 2 where they doubled the API set. They're over, I think they said they think they're over 90% of the APIs there now. I said that most teams failed at that. One team didn't. That was the PowerShell team. And guess what? It was hard. It's really, really, really hard. We had to rework an incredible amount of code to get working on .NET Core. But that's what it took to be open source. And again, doing all that grunt work just to get what? Just to get it to do what it did, but now we can do it on Linux. Okay, so that was very hard stuff. Next is we had to make sure that when we go to Linux, we treat Linux as a first-class citizen, right? Look, I'm under no illusions, right? Had no expectation that the Linux people were gonna sit there and say, oh God, would someone please save us from the oppression of Bash and Python? if only Microsoft could come in here and rescue us, you know, liberate us. That did not happen. That's not what we expected, right? Look, let's be frank, right? We had a CEO who just said the worst things about their technology and their community and called it a cancer, and they heard that. They heard that. They remember that, and they attribute it to the company, and that's fair, okay? So what that means is, you know, we have to be beyond reproach. Look, I have to earn their business, right? All I'm asking is the right to earn their business. And when we do that, if they listen to us, if there's an open to listen to us, we're gonna be judged based upon the reality of what we do. So with that, I know that there's a lot of suspicion. And what hit me at some point was, I had a great plan to make PowerShell available on Linux, but on Windows, I have PowerShell ISE, this great authoring, graphical debugging experience. And I didn't have that and could not have that on Linux because it's WPF based. And so I realized, yeah, they're gonna look at this and say, see, I knew it. You know, you're just giving us the dregs, the real play, the real actions happening on Windows. We're just a second-class citizen. And I couldn't allow that at all. And so that's when we really invested in Visual Studio Code. And boy, has that just taken off. You know, right guy, right arrangement, Keith Hill. Boy, I talk about David Wilson a lot, but Keith Hill is also part of the project. The two of them have just done an awesome project. Now here's the thing to get focused. That's not a Microsoft thing. That's a community thing. Now I've got a Microsoft guy working on it full time, but Keith Hill's working on it as well as the community. So that's just working out fantastic. Anyway, that's why that is our direction going forward. And I'd say that in many ways it's ahead of ISE. In a few ways it's behind, but they're moving so fast. They'll be better very quickly. We also needed to be culturally compatible with Linux, right? So, you know, thank God, last beta, a week or so ago, we finally added ampersand backgrounding. So you can say get process ampersand and it runs in the background. We didn't have that, right? So on Windows, you can sort of get your head around it. Obviously, you have for the last 10 years, nobody's been complaining. But can you imagine a Linux shell that can't support backgrounding with ampersand? I mean, they would just like, what are you, dope? You know, you just don't understand us. You're not even really trying to understand and respect our idioms and our ways. And so it was important that we did that. Now, by the way, I'd love some help there. I'd love some help there. On the GitHub page, we have a list of things that we think are the completer things. Like, I won't ship PowerShell without them. The things I care most about are these cultural things, where the Linux guys say, hey, you're just not doing it the right way. Now, just to be clear, in order to do this, we have had to introduce some breaking changes into PowerShell. That's the bad news. The good news is most of those, I believe, will be on the edge cases, and most people will not even notice them. If you do notice them, I'm sorry. The reason why I'm introducing these is to be a full first-class great citizen of Linux and to do this new path forward. We'll stay with those. So, I mean, certainly tell me about them to make sure that I'm making a conscious decision, but I will accept the ramification of breaking changes to embrace and execute on this new mission. Okay, so I talked about it, OpenSSH, the open sourcing of editor services and Visual Studio Code. Now, both Keith Hill and Dave Wilson are the maintainers for this. We will have, and in fact now do have, maintainers, external community maintainers for PowerShell itself. Okay? Now, what does it take to be a maintainer? And the answer is you have to be an expert in the code, right? Because basically you say, I don't know, PowerShell does this. You take a snapshot, do a branch, change the code, make sure the tests all run, and you do a pull request. A maintainer has to evaluate that code and will say, okay, actually you missed something, you have to do it this way, or you've got to add this other piece, and then accept it, okay? So they have to be an expert in the code. Because PowerShell's been closed source to now, no one in the community is an expert in the code. So it takes a while for the community to become experts. But we fully expect them to have community maintainers for PowerShell itself. We in fact now have one community maintainer for PowerShell. That's the good news. The bad news is it's because one of the PowerShell team left the company and went to work for some other company, but he said, I love PowerShell so much, can I continue to work on it? It's like, wait, so they're gonna pay you and you wanna, yes, I'll accept that deal. So we have our first community maintainer for PowerShell. That's great. Now, so here's the story of PowerShell and DevOps. So anybody heard of Cloud Platform Solution? Cloud Platform Solution was basically our attempt to do a private cloud in the box, right? There were two flavors of that. First, Cloud Platform Solution, called Cloud Platform Solution Premium, and you basically said, I want 1, 2, 3, or 4 racks of computers. We provision that with PowerShell, so we provision it using PowerShell, and we use System Center to maintain it. We give you a private cloud, self-service IaaS. And at the time, desired state configuration was just beginning, and so it was an inappropriate technology to do that. But then the second phase of this was something called CPS standard, where we extend the number of vendors and make it a little bit more open. They can do a bunch more. And I said, okay, now as we go there, I want you to rewrite that provisioning stuff using desired state configuration. The development manager said, yeah, you got a problem with that. I said, okay, what's the problem? I said, my developers hate PowerShell. I said, oh, well, let me talk to them. And so I sat down. I said, well, why do you hate PowerShell? And they said, well, look, I love it, but no, like, I don't want to use it. I said, okay, great. Tell me why. And he said, well, listen, I'm a developer, and I'm going to get judged by my ability to deliver a set of things. So here are the issues I'm having with PowerShell. One is, I'm a developer. I use Visual Studio, right? I use Visual Studio. That's the tool I use. You have this PowerShell ISE. It's nice, but it's not Visual Studio. It doesn't integrate in with our source code control. It's not something that people know. So that's a problem. Okay, great. What else? Well, look, I'm the general contractor of this project, and I go to these guys and I say, hey, you need to give me this. You need to give me this. You need to give me this. He says, the typical way I think about doing that is through interfaces and classes, and I don't have that in PowerShell. And so I've got to do it through script signatures, and they just can't get it right. They just don't know. It's hard to convey a contract through a script signature and for people to get that right. Next is that when I write code, I unit test it, and there's no unit test framework. Okay, so all these things, and then I've got to write it all down. So, okay, great. And then a few days later, I was walking to get a cup of coffee, and the director of development, I thought he was going to punch me in the face. I mean, I really did. He was just so angry with me. And he says, "You screwed up my schedule." I was like, "Okay, I'm pretty sure I didn't screw up your schedule, but okay, say more. What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, basically, one of his developers had taken a script and checked it in, and he made a stupid mistake." He says, "And that cost me 2 days You know, why isn't there something like lint for PowerShell so that before this person can check in stupid code like that, it gets blocked? So that's a very good point. That is the story behind PowerShell version 4, right? That's where we started to add classes with 4 or 5. I'm bad with versions, but we embraced Pester as a unit test framework, looked at doing our own, saw a great one out there in the community, 2 birds with 1 stone. Said, hey, we can adopt that, looks great, and I'm now gonna take open source software and ship it in Windows. Really, you can't do that. Well, let's find out. And the answer is we could. And because we were the first team to take open source software and ship it as part of Windows, and let me tell you, there's some hurdles involved in that. Now other people are like, hey, in that case, they did it, we can do it too. And so you see more and more of that happening. So we did the unit test framework. We worked with the community to get Visual Studio Code to support this and started the Visual Studio Code project. That actually came later, but we worked to make sure it worked well in Visual Studio. We added classes. Now classes is it's a big comprehensive subject. We have the core of classes. It does allow you to define a contract between people, and that's how we're using it in Azure Stack. And then we also we are doing additional work on debugging. Anyway, so that's why we did those features, and now in reality, I said we always wanted to be the language that allowed developers and operators to work together. In reality, we started off largely focused in on operations and IT, and then step by step, we've been enhancing it for developers with 4 or 5, whichever it was. That was a big click, big investment to be more developer friendly. And that's paying off very, very well. Azure Stack, you might have heard of this thing called Azure Stack. Azure Stack, somebody did a search the other day and said that there were over 250,000 lines of PowerShell written in Azure Stack. So that's pretty big. By the way, have you seen this? As part of Azure Stack, we've been doing we need better debugging. So now, this will come as a combination of Visual Studio Code, and you can do it with PowerShell version 6. If you say invoke command, and sometimes you give a little script block, like run this command. And sometimes we have invoke command, and then this big script block, right? Azure Stack is a bunch of that, like big script blocks running over there. So how do I debug that, right? It's kind of hard. Well, now what you can do is in Visual Studio Code, you get to invoke command, you click F11, and you step into the code block running on the remote machine. It does all the connections, wires everything up, and then you're single stepping or setting breakpoints on the remote machine. It's a wonderful experience. I strongly encourage you to kick the tires on that. It's fantastic. Anybody ever try and debug an RS or a DSC resource? Horrible, huh? Yeah. Good thing you didn't try it. I hope that means you don't write DSC resources versus you don't test them. or that you write perfect code. That'd be even better. Yeah, anyway, so now we've fixed that. And so now it's a much more focused experience. Okay, so in order to do this mission of manage anything, anywhere, etc., we really need to support DevOps, and this is what we've done for that. By the way, everything that I'm talking to you about are the first steps. These are the directions, the streams of investment we have going forward to achieve this new mission. Core PowerShell in Azure, we have a principle at Microsoft, and that is first party, third party. We wanted third parties to use the tools that first party use. We want first party to use the tools third parties use. So we're trying to get PowerShell and desired state configuration into the core of Azure. This requires a number of changes. So I mentioned the cloud command console, that's going well. But we want to use desired state configuration as the native Azure configuration technology. So step number 1, we need to have a common local configuration manager between Windows and Linux. We have 2 separate implementation, 2 different sets of bugs, etc. So we need to fix that. We are going to allow multiple LCM resources and to allow LCM to be a library within an application. Here's what this does. In desired state configuration, we have this idea of partial configuration. Partial configuration says, I'm going to go to you for this set of configuration, I'm gonna use you for this set of configuration, and then I'll make sure that they don't conflict, and if they conflict, I have a way to say, you're the exclusive owner of these resources, and you're the exclusive owner of these resources. We have that in place. But what happens is, whenever I do a convergence cycle, we converge the entire system. Allowing multiple LCMs allows me to do partial configurations and to say, the resources from you, I'm gonna configure or converge once a day, whereas the configuration from you, I'm gonna do once a minute. Now, once a minute, well, still that can be heavyweight, so you want it to be as lightweight as possible. So that's why the LCM as a library within an application. So that's what we're doing there. And we're writing a native code LCM, sort of an LCM bootstrapper. And this will be the thing that bootstraps other LCMs and is very lightweight, can be used very, very early on in the system. So, back to the question, is PowerShell done? The answer is no. You see these streams of investment, what we're doing, they're all about shifting our focus from Windows to being cross-platform. Shifting our focus from just being a platform to actually going and solving those problems. Now, to be fair, we started that with desired state configuration and Pester, where instead of saying, hey, I'm a general purpose language, you do the rest, we're saying we're having a strong, well, I want to solve the unit test problem. I want to solve the configuration management problem. You'll see more and more of that. And shifting the focus from just servers to be services, applications, and clouds. So again, the vision, manage from any client, manage any server, any cloud, on-premise, the whole thing. One tool to do it all. And the question is why? Right? Why would you go through all that pain? Why would you go through all that misery, do all that work? What's the point? And here's the answer. It's about your transformational changes. We want PowerShell to be the tool to help you with your transformational changes, right? You've already done the one. You've shifted from GUIs to automation. But most everybody in the room will be doing one or more of the following transformations. Going from management of silos to managing the entire estate. Look, here's the deal. You're a great Windows admin, excellent, you're worth this much. You're a great Windows Linux admin, you're worth more. Now, if you have to go pick up a brand new set of tools to do that job, that can be tough. I want to empower you to use your skills that you've already invested in and earn more money. Simple as that. Nothing makes me happier than when you make more money, when you become the hero. This is not about us, it's not about technology, it's not about PowerShell, it's about you. And we're doing all this hard work to help you with these transformations. Transformation from traditional IT to DevOps, right? The transformation from on-premises to cloud. So we're all about helping you be the tool, the one thing you don't need to worry about. You have that skill set, you can apply it to these new transformations to help you with that. So I thought I'd talk about how to succeed with these transformations, right? Because again, you want to recognize this thing. As you do these things, recognize that it's different than an incremental change, that it's a transformational change, and make the choices required to succeed. Here's some my advice on how to deal with some of these challenges. When there's no playbook, here's the deal. You're going to be uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is the new norm. I hate being uncomfortable. Look, I'm a technical fellow. Microsoft has over 110,000 employees. We have 23 technical fellows. Most of those are really vice presidents who have the technical fellow title because of a budgeting thing. We have only 11 individual contributors that are technical fellows. 4 of those guys are research guys, so we have 7 or 8 individual technical contributors on products. Really sucks to feel uncomfortable. Really sucks to say I have no idea. Really sucks to say, I don't know. Like I'm supposed to be the one who knows. So these things are really uncomfortable, right? Uncomfortable is the new norm. Just get used to it. When it comes to new way of thinking, I find that you always just go back to first principles. It's the thing I learned in physics. Like ignore all the details, ignore all the details. What matters? What's the heart? What is it you're trying to achieve? What really drives things forward? Figure those things out and then go forward from there. This idea of failures will happen. Again, draw the distinction between a 2-day failure and a 2-year failure. 2-day failures, like, love it. Like, thanks, that's great. I'm glad you failed fast. 2-year failures, like, what are you gonna do next? Okay. This new identity in customers, right? Just have confidence in the path, right? Have courage. Now, we often, Microsoft, we always try and hire like really smart people, or we have domain expertise. And what I'm trying to do is to shift that and say, look, I'm not sure that's what the filter we want to use for hiring people, right? So concretely, you're a domain expert. What does that matter? I mean, if you think about it, this never, and the thing that excites me the most about this phase of the industry, this is an industry of change, it's an industry of revolution. But in the past, we sort of have a relatively fixed environment, and then we'd have a revolution in an area. We'd have to like scramble to get that in focus, adjust, great, go execute on that, and then something else would happen. But right now, there is a revolution going on, deep fundamental revolution going on at every single layer of the technology stack, right? The silicon, the systems, the storage, the networking, the cloud application architectures, every single layer is having a transformation all at once, okay? So it's very difficult to become an expert in any of this. So you have to like just have confidence. You got to get used to this, being uncomfortable, and go for it. And then sing again, one of the hardest things, not everybody makes it. Not everybody makes it. And so Colin Powell once said, don't let adverse facts get in the way of a good decision. So convince yourself that the transformational change that you're on is the right thing to do, and then there's just going to be ramifications with that. Okay, so in summary, PowerShell's really all about making you successful. And right now, it's widely used through the industry. I don't know we're all trying to figure out what happened, but it seemed like about a year ago, maybe 10 months ago, there's a very, very noticeable, it had been pretty widely used, but about 10 months ago, a year ago, there's this dramatic uptick. And sort of everybody's seeing it, and we're not entirely sure why. But anyway, so PowerShell version 5.1, PowerShell, Windows PowerShell, that's great. It's awesome. But we are investing heavily, and we're transforming to enable you to solve bigger and harder problems, right? Again, so that you can be the hero and be rewarded. That's what this is all about. That's why we're doing the hard work. So with that, we've got some time for questions. Oh wait, so sort of feel, does this make sense?
Yes.